Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome back to the Mob Archaeologist. I'm Angelo here with Rick and Eric. Unfortunately, Tony's not going to be able to make it. We're here with two very special guests. First, we have James, aka JCB 1977 from the Black Hand Forum. He's been a longtime contributor. He also has a very extensive background going back to Youngstown. And then we also have Paul Hodos. Paul here recently wrote a book, Steel City Mafia. That's going to be coming out very soon. And that's about generally the history of Pittsburgh in the later era of time. And yeah, we're here to discuss that. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having us.
Paul, would you mind going into, just a basic summary of your work and the book that you're putting out?
Sure, Angela. Thank you. So it's called Steel City Mafia, uh, and it's basically about the last era of the Pittsburgh mob, like you said. It focuses on the late 70s to the 2000s when it kind of died out. The last made guy died in 2021, so that was the last remnant. And basically, it also goes into it a little more quickly with and I know your guys' show focuses on the early years of some of the mafia families around the United States. Mine goes into that a little bit, but it's more for background purposes. The Prohibition era and John LaRocca, Frank Amato, like sort of the 40s through the 60s. John LaRocca being obviously a very important character. And then when you're building the characters, you have to go into their past history too. While I focus on, for instance, Mike Genovese, who was the boss from the 80s to the 2000s, he had a long run before then. He was a really powerful guy, basically since the mid 50s on, and that story is definitely necessary to tell prior to. So I do get into that older era, but it's from the point of view of guys who lived into the 80s, basically. And it's just nice to finally get a book about Pittsburgh out there in its totality. It's been a long time coming. Like in the late 90s, I wanted this book really badly, and it's just kind of nice that I got to write it. The family hasn't got as much attention as it should, and I feel like some people in my old home area, and I'm from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was actually where one of the crews were. It People don't even understand exactly what was going on. Some of them don't even know that there was organized crime, and if they do, they think of it as this like monolithic secret society, kind of like what people probably would have thought of it before the FBI started working it. Kind of like, what is this thing? Like, I don't even know what that is. And I wanted to make the book accessible to those types of people that are just completely new to this kind of world. Maybe they read a book about New York or Philly or something like that. But also try to satisfy people like you guys, especially like people like Jimmy too, like who are very involved in researching and all that. And I tried to please both, and I think it did an okay job of that. So, but it's an interesting family, as we were talking about before we started here. It's very spread out. When I refer to a crew in a New York family, capo de China, you got 10 soldiers and all that. For Pittsburgh, a crew to me is basically one made guy and a bunch of associates in a town. And those towns, the main towns are Youngstown, Steubenville, Johnstown, Altoona, Erie to a certain extent, New Kensington, even though you might consider that part of Pittsburgh in a way, suburbs. And like a few others are in there too. But each of them kind of had one or two made guys and then a few associates, sometimes more than a few. And then Pittsburgh, you had sort of like a general grouping. But in this period of the family's history, probably only 20 made members, and that fluctuated over the years back and forth a little bit. And part of the story is it's kind of the decline of this mafia family. But the story also starts out with resurgence. Genovese instituted a street tax on gambling that LaRocca had a street tax too, to a certain, every mob don does, right? But he really like enforced it. Basically, what somebody who, an investigator who worked this case told me, he told everybody, spread the message, the free ride is over, you guys are going to pay me now. So even small bookmakers were getting hit up. And he took over this very large independent gambling operation that was led by a guy named Grosso. He went to prison right around the same time Genovese became the Don. And that really infused the family with a bunch of cash. They also started to get into the drug trade. Their underboss was really kind of like a leader of drug dealers, is what I would say, part of his business. And that hurt the family eventually, but for like a 5-year period, they were making probably a lot more money than they were at the end of John LaRocca's reign, because they were just pushing a little harder out there. And like I said, with Tony Grosso's empire getting folded in, that was a big deal. In Philly, you had kind of that same thing going on. Scarfo instituted the street tax, and then the Rickabeenies resisted that. And there was a war, but in Pittsburgh's case, they just took it over.
May I ask
without any blood.
I'm sorry, may I ask something?
Sure.
Tony Grosso, he was in the Hill District, am I right or wrong?
So, to be honest with you, like his operation, I'm a little bit brain farting here about where exactly he lived, but his operation was all over. Like it was a $30 million a year operation. He had thousands of numbers writers and runners.
Yep.
It was pretty gigantic. It was kind of like a shadow mafia in a way. And the reason that it stayed independent so long is because he was basically, like they say in The Godfather Part 1, like he had the politicians in his pocket, like so many nickels and dimes. So the family had a hard time touching him. And basically what he provided to them that they didn't bother him for the most part for was political protection for some of their stuff, and a little bit of money from what I understand, not as much as he certainly would be made to pay if he was really under them. And then also hints about coming investigations from his political contacts, like corrupted police and whatnot. Hey, there's a raid coming, guys. Gotta get prepared for that. So that kept him insulated. Jimmy, do you know exactly where he was living?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Tony Grosso. There was a book years ago, Paul. I want to say it was written in the 1980s. It was a book called Pittsburgh Characters.
Mhm.
And one of the chapters in that book was dedicated to Tony and his brother Sam and the entire Grosso operation. But you're right on the money. He lived in Mount Lebanon, the same town that John Bazzano Sr. lived in, which, as you know, one of the more wealthier enclaves over there in Allegheny County. You had to have some money, and typically the people that lived there were your lawyers, your judges, your doctors, your educated elite class of people. There was a movie done, I think John Travolta was in it, called Lucky Numbers, and it was loosely based off the entire Tony Grosso trial and his operation. And from the research that I've accumulated, he was definitely paying something. He had that agreement with John LaRocca, and you're absolutely right. He was offering political protection, and the piece of the pie was very small, and it was just the cost of doing business, until he went to prison. And, then the Williams brothers and Bobby Iannelli assumed most of that operation. But, also from what I've gathered, Bobby Iannelli was very independent from LCN as well. He did pay he did pay a tax, but it wasn't a tax that a lot of associates or made members would have had to pay. But him and the Williams brothers split that operation up, from what I have found.
And Ian is actually one of the few guys who's still alive, I think. He's
He
very,
is.
very
He just had that recent gambling bust a couple of years ago.
Mhm. But he was an associate, not made, or is
Correct. No, I from everything I've gathered, he's never been made. Never been made.
I want to go back to the
But
size of the family real quick. You mentioned the small size. What we consider in America as a small size is actually closer to the way the Sicilian mafia was. Most Sicilian mafia families were, where 20 members was not abnormal. I know Nicola Gentile said around 1932, when he transferred from Pittsburgh to the Gambinos, that they had around 70 members, which is pretty big, for non-New York families. But then way later, we know Sam Manorino cooperated a little bit with the FBI, and he basically implied they barely made members. They hadn't made members for a very long time. That's something we see, especially in the Midwest, and Pittsburgh's more of a Midwest family. I think you guys would agree. Like, it's Pennsylvania, but
Mhm.
Pittsburgh's in that Midwest network. But we see that those families really didn't make people. It was being a member was a very exclusive opportunity. And like what you were saying, Paul, about some of these guys who were a soldier, but really they were kind of the boss of the territory, and they had associates. And that's something that's hard for outsiders to understand. It's something we talk about a lot. But I'm glad that you pointed that out, because this is a family that might have been bigger at one point, but they didn't really make members. They're kind of like Cleveland. And then being a member meant something more than just soldier. It meant you were essentially a leader unto yourself. That's basically what you found, right?
Yes, and especially for the ones who are outside the greater Pittsburgh area, they really had a lot of autonomy. Um, and not to say that they weren't still controlled and had to pay up and all that sort of thing. And that's where the confusion comes sometimes, where people think like Youngstown was its own thing or Wheeling was its own thing. But they gave associates a ton of power because they had to, and because they were so stingy with membership. Um, I think that was a survival mechanism. I think it was a trust issue. I think it was, to a certain extent, New York kind of dictated limits on that family too. Um, not too much details on that, unfortunately, but that's what's in some of the stuff. And like the associates are, for like, in charge of a whole city, like a 50,000 person city, or 60,000, 100,000 sometimes. And it's amazing. And especially, like, I'll give Altoona as an example. The lead guy down there is a guy named Jack Vrilla, who's kind of a little bit of a loose cannon, and a big mouth. And he went to prison for murder in 1984. And the person who took over for him was a guy named Alfred Corbo, who never really spent significant time in prison. He had a little bit of a gambling bust in the early 90s. But he ran that city like a made guy. Like, he had associates under him. People, according to the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, like, feared him just as much as they did Jack Vrilla. He was quieter than Jack, but he was still their man down there. And in fact, he was so powerful that Jack Vrilla at one point, because he wasn't listening to him as much as he would have liked, asked for permission to kill Alfred Corbo, and they told him no, because he was making more money than he was. So associates were super important. I'm glad that you guys appreciate that, because it's something that makes Pittsburgh, I think, a little bit different.
One of the things, Paul, thank you very much, for getting into that. Through our conversation and through some of our dialogue the other day, you had mentioned through your sources, that, in 1989, when the Patriarcha family had that making ceremony recorded, that you had received a little bit of information that was one of the things that really scared Mike Genovese, is when that induction ceremony was caught on tape. And it's murky, right? When you're looking at the period that you're looking at, John LaRocca dies in December of '84. Mike is named boss. In 1986, they make Thomas Sonny Chinsuti, which, to be quite honest, when I had found that out, I was surprised, because he had so much power under the Manarino organization in the 60s. He was taking care of so much for the Manarinos that I was surprised it took that long for him to get made. And then Chucky Porter, in 1986 as well. Chucky Porter, very, very interesting character. And I'm sure we're going to dive into him in a little bit. On his mother's side of the family, her maiden name was Gia Lanella. And he had an uncle that was a big numbers writer back in the 60s, 50s, 60s. If I'm not mistaken, I think his name was Arthur or Art Gialanella. I could be off on that first name, but those two get made. And then in 1987, you have the two guys in Youngstown, Joey Naples and Lenny Strollo, that were made. And then the argument comes in Zebo, Henry Zatola. I have not found anything definitive through any documents, through any FBI affidavits, or any sources within the Justice Department that he was made. However, I think, we all know on the Black Hand Forum, we all know Friend of Henry. Regardless of what anybody's thoughts are on him. I happen to know him personally. We've spent a lot of time together when I'm back in Youngstown visiting. We know a lot of the same people. Some of his friends were some of my family's friends. And, I think sometimes it's easy for us to misconstrue, or maybe take something personal on maybe his keyboard etiquette, so to speak, on the forum. But he spent an awful lot of time with a group of the fellas that you're writing about, especially Henry. Henry was one of his best friends. He baptized him, one of his godfathers. Friend of Henry, he had shared with the board, and he had shared with me that, Michael made Henry in 1989 after Chucky got indicted, that he needed somebody that he trusted close to him now that Chucky was indicted, to kind of take care of a lot of the things that needed taken care of, especially in Youngstown. In your research, Paul, and like I said, I have not found anything definitive about that, right? I tend to believe that. I tend to lean that way for the mere fact of the amount of responsibility that was given to him. I mean, one could make the argument, especially from 1990 on, that Zatola was basically the street boss. You can make that. You can certainly make a very compelling argument that everybody answered to him at that point. Mike insulated himself very, very well. And, I know, and I would love to bring him on as Mike Genovese Jr. Mike and I talk, and, I do know that once Chucky got indicted, his father became a recluse. He didn't know who to trust. He was blown away by the indictments and, the serious charges, the narcotics, and there was so much heat going on there. And he knew that the feds had a target right on his back. that he became very reclusive, and all of his orders were given directly through Henry to everybody else that was operating. Now, we also need to keep in mind that, in 1990, not only did Pittsburgh's hierarchy and some of their key guys go down in that trial, but it essentially, Paul Hankish was also indicted, right around the same time, and it was all the same charges. The entire Wheeling, West Virginia faction was completely wiped out after they had gone to prison. The Pittsburgh family lost that stream of revenue to Wheeling right around those indictments in 1990, because the narcotics trafficking, if I'm not mistaken, Paul didn't make bail. They had him locked up, and I think his key lieutenant was a guy by the name, did you come across him, James Griffin?
Yeah, he was definitely one of his guys. And Iacovetti.
Yeah, Iacovetti was another one, right? He had a whole cast of characters, but they got wiped out, and the gambling money and all of that, they were not getting paid anymore on that when those guys were locked up. With Youngstown being one of the factions within that umbrella of the Pittsburgh family, you still had about another decade of income, coming in. Now, I do know that, Mike Genovese, back in Youngstown in the mid 80s, actually starting in the early 80s, there was an old bar in Camel, Ohio. And Camel was it used to be called East Youngstown, and then it got annexed and they renamed it way back when. You had Lenny Strollo's brother Dante there. You had Ernie B. and Dillo. You had a lot of the Greeks that were running the gambling in Camel. They had the Greek Coffee House, and then most importantly, they had something called the All-American Club Casino, and it was Bernie Altshuler and Ernie B. and Dillo that ran that. The All-American Club, when the FBI busted it, Special Agent Bob Kroner stated it was the largest illegal casino outside of Las Vegas and Atlantic City. And it was bringing in $20 million a year to the Pittsburgh family. By that time, they had all the high rollers gambling there. And once the steel mills had shut down, and Black Monday happened in Youngstown in the 70s, so many people started fleeing the city, going where there was work. And, the mob, all those good jobs were gone. All those union jobs, those wages, those steady paychecks, week in and week out, it was gone. And they had to find gamblers. And that's when they started turning kind of the African-American sector. Crack became the new big thing in the 80s. And you had everybody slinging rock on the corner, and they were catering to that clientele, people coming in, $50,000, $100,000 in a briefcase, and they were gambling. But $20 million a year, the Pittsburgh family were certainly taking a piece of that. And Henry Zatola was the guy that came every single week to collect that envelope from Bernie Altshuler, where he and Henry, they went back to their childhood. Same with Lenny Strollo. A lot of those guys knew each other going back into their late teens and their early 20s. So those relationships were there. They had a lot of years vested into them. And, at the end of the day, the Pittsburgh family still had those streams of incomes coming in. I mean, in Erie, PA, jumping over to Northwest Pennsylvania, I always found it funny that Raymond Ferrito, ended up taking over the gambling there. Ray Ferrito, was one of the guys involved in the Danny Green bombing. He became an FBI informant. He cooperated. And then he ended up going over to Erie, PA. I think the gentleman's name that got killed that was running all the gambling there, if I'm not mistaken, was Frank Dovashaw.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And Ray Ferrito assumed that operation. And ironically, he was laying off all of his money to Bobby Iannelli and the Sabatini brothers that ran a very large tri-state gambling operation in Pittsburgh. Gerald Sabatini was one of them. Robert Sabatini was another one. But the FBI, I mean, a lot of that layoff money was going from Ferrito directly to Pittsburgh bookmakers. And I always wonder, like, what were these guys thinking? They knew he was an informant. They knew that he cooperated with the FBI, yet they were still doing business with him. I don't have vast knowledge on Ray Ferrito. A lot of the information that I'm talking about comes right out of the 1990 Pennsylvania Crime Commission report on organized crime. But that's a very good report because it's very detailed.
Ferrito was close to the LA guys, right? He was close to Fratiano. That was
Yes, he was very, very close to Jimmy Fratiano.
And Erie's interesting because Erie obviously intersected with Pittsburgh. It was nothing like Youngstown in terms of different families being in one place, but Buffalo also had members there. There was a guy, Salamone, who was often sometimes mislabeled as a Pittsburgh member, but he was actually a Buffalo member. But it shows you from the outside, kind of hard to see. That's one of the things I find the most interesting about this subject, and Pittsburgh is one of the best examples. So I'm looking forward to what you guys have to say, where it shows you that, like, there were made members, a bunch of guys who were made members in certain locations, but like Youngstown, affiliated with different families, but they spent more time with each other. They spent more time mingling, with people of different families, and were kind of their own de facto group. And then Erie, not quite like Youngstown, but still a little bit of that. There was crossover where jurisdictions.
Sure. A little history of Erie. When you go back to the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a gentleman there who actually became the stepfather of Ray Ferrito. His name was Serafino Romeo, and they called him Sam. And he owned some vending machine businesses there. And he was a first cousin of Paul and Mike Romeo in Youngstown. FBI reports that I have read through in the 1960s on the Charles Cavallaro bombing. They described Serafino Sam Romeo in Erie, PA, quote unquote, as an old hatchet man for the organization. That he was in it from the ground up, from the beginning. And you're absolutely right, Eric. I'm fascinated with James Salamone. His nickname was Jimmy Westfield, or Westfield Jimmy. He came from Westfield, New York, which is the first or second exit. When you cross over Erie, PA, it was the first or second exit right off Interstate 90, Westfield, New York. And that's why they called him Jimmy Westfield. Well, I was reading some reports on Mogadino the other day, and what I had come to learn is two of the informants in that specific report had stated that once Stefano Mogadino died, Jimmy Westfield aligned himself more with Pittsburgh because of his close relationship with John LaRocca post Mogadino. I found that it piqued my interest, and I've been trying to run some other searches to see if I can find some other sources that were reporting that, because when I go through some of John LaRocca's FBI files, James Salamone was one of the gentlemen that he would go down to Hot Springs, Arkansas with. It was somebody that he spent personal time with. John LaRocca, way back in the day, he was in Jamestown, New York, which is right near Westfield, New York, right near Erie, PA. and he was running a gas station, at that time. And then he started, he got into the bootlegging of liquor, from Jamestown, New York, which, a lot of the bootlegging through that area of New York and Buffalo was all coming from Canada, across Lake Erie, coming down Route 90 and coming through Buffalo, crossing over into a little war zone in the 1920s and 30s named Bradford, Pennsylvania, which was a bootlegger's paradise. It was right on the border of a little town called Olean, New York. And I don't want to go too much into it, but those little pockets right in that area, Angelo, myself, and Rick, we have over the years we've really looked into the real early stuff, and those little pockets where you're seeing a more mature criminal organization like the mafia operating, some of those little pockets were hotbeds for early Black Hand activity. So there's so much history that goes on with some of those sections, especially Western New York and with its proximity to Ontario. But that's kind of what I'm gung ho to find. I just joined this Buffalo mob group on Facebook, and I'm hoping maybe somebody on there that might not be on the forum could maybe shed some light. Trying to kind of scroll through and educate myself and see who's making sense on that. But I don't know if you came across that, Paul, in your book about Jimmy Salamone kind of in his later years affiliating more with John LaRocca. And I'm sitting there trying to put two and two together. You got Ray Ferrito and his crew operating in Erie, and they're working with a network of bookmakers that are all affiliated under the umbrella of the Pittsburgh family. And then you have James Salamone that had traditionally been running that area for decades. One would think, why isn't Ray Ferrito working with Buffalo?
I haven't
maybe
found
those informants, I don't know. Maybe those informants are onto something.
I didn't find anything more than what you said. In fact, I definitely learned something from what you just said. But the enduring mystery for me is how did Ray Ferrito work in the underworld after he was an informant? It doesn't make sense. I wish I knew that. That must be an interesting story. I wish I knew this story.
One thing I want to comment on is in Buffalo, starting in early 1969, there was an inter-family coup where the Buffalo faction tried to depose Megadino, and that continued. Like that family was in disarray for years through Megadino's death, and I'm wondering if that played a role. Like we know Rochester tried to break off; they had ties to Pittsburgh. There was a lot of factionalism and groups were operating separately. I could easily see Salamone, because of that, maybe gravitating toward a different family. His own family's kind of busted up at that time. Who knows how that impacted things too,
Yeah, and I agree with you. It could have happened earlier. In the Pennsylvania Crime Commission reports, I think it says that Erie started to move towards Pittsburgh in the early 80s. But that's just one source, so that could have been a trend that was going on, and they just didn't notice it until later. But Erie, as far as the family was concerned, was pretty quiet once it was in Pittsburgh's orbit. It was making money, but it wasn't making headlines. I feel the same way about Johnstown too. But the Pennsylvania Crime Commission does say that, if I'm remembering correctly, like that the Buffalo Mafia is weakening power in that region. Basically, Pittsburgh just walked in and was like, "All right, we're here now." Basically, no bloodshed.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the Ohio River Valley, it has an illustrious history, yet there are just time periods that are murky. You know, FBI agents that I've spoken with that have worked Youngstown, that were there in the 60s and 70s, have all claimed at that time that Youngstown was a wide open territory back in the 60s. You had representatives from 4 different families all running rackets in Youngstown. You had Buffalo, Joe DiCarlo was there. You had in Detroit, you had Camerata, who was in Youngstown for Detroit. Cleveland, you had guys like Charlie Cavallaro, he was a Cleveland member. Jimmy Prado, he was a Pittsburgh member, but they had representatives. And back in the 1940s, Paul, I don't know if you came across this name, but he certainly was probably one of the most important figures in the time period that you're writing on, is Charles, last name is Imburgia, and he went by the name of Charlie Murgy.
Yeah.
I can tell you, growing up, I probably went to his pizza shop twice a week. Didn't have a clue on who he was. But he came from Pittsburgh and he was sent to Youngstown in the 1940s to keep an eye on the Jungle Inn casino that was just bringing in so much money for the Cleveland and Pittsburgh families. He, at the time, he was Frank Amato and John LaRocca's representative coming into Youngstown to keep an eye, so the money kept coming in on that casino. And he ended up settling in Warren, Ohio. I remember reading, it was a 1990 or 91, it was a report. Roger Greenbank went, he was pretty extensive in this report on Local 1058 in Pittsburgh, the Laborers International Union. And Roger had clearly demonstrated who the power players were in Pittsburgh. And he had, in 1989, Roger had Charlie Imburgia as the consigliere. At that time, in the 90s, according per his FBI report, he was working very closely with John Peanuts Tronalone, who took over the Cleveland family when the Cleveland family got shattered after Angelo Leonardo's testimony. And Tronalone was living in South Florida, and he was coming back up, meeting with guys. People were going down to Florida. LaRocca lived down there. LaRocca was dead by then. But he was down in Florida, and he was just trying to keep the agreement between Pittsburgh and Cleveland that 25% of the Mahoning County and Trumbull County gambling revenue was going to continue to go to Cleveland, and the other 75% at that time was going over to Pittsburgh. But Lenny Strollo, a Pittsburgh member, it was the last federal mob trial in Cleveland federal court. He had stated in his testimony that once Joey Naples was assassinated in 1991, who was the co-boss with him, that he was summoned. He used the word summoned in his testimony to the house of Charlie Murgy. And Charlie Murgy was there with Pat Ferruccio, and that's when they made him boss of Youngstown right after the death in August of 1991 of Joey Naples. So, what that tells me is that still in the early 90s, Charlie Murgy is summoning him. You come to my home, I have a message to pass on to you. So, he and Mike were very, very, very close. Charlie's son-in-law and Mike Genovese's son are to this day still very, very, very close. There was a trusting relationship between Mike and Charlie. And Charlie and Mike, they spent a lot of time together. They would go to Jojo Pecora's hunting camp that friend of Henry, so often refers to camp. Jojo Pecora owned a hunting camp up in Tionesta, Pennsylvania, in the middle of nowhere. And they would go up there, and the guys would go up there and they would hunt. And a lot of the times they had a lot of business associates in Philadelphia, and it was kind of a meeting point. Now, friend of Henry will also tell you that he was not privy to any of those conversations. Those guys went out into the woods with their guns and they talked business while they were hunting where nobody was around. But Charlie, to say the least, he was certainly one of the power players in that post 1984 death of John LaRocca. He was one of the power players there.
Here's something interesting too, because I'm always fascinated in the national connections, the relationships.
Sure.
Some of these guys came from clans, where multiple relatives ended up made members. And Tony, who's not here, but Tony discovered that Charlie Murgy, you said his, Imburgia is his real name, that he's actually the first cousin of Joe Bolger, true name Imburgia, who was a made member in Chicago, also a lawyer and a former mayor, very close to the Chicago leadership. They were actually first cousins, Sicilians.
So what's the actual surname, Eric?
Imburgia or Imburgio. I think they used them both. Oh, and we know the O's.
See, I always thought it was Imburgia, and then Murgy was like more of a nickname that he just kind of adopted.
Yeah, you're right. You're correct. 100% correct.
That's interesting. What was the gentleman's name out of Chicago?
He went by Joe Bolger. Was Bolger? He took that on. It wasn't just a nickname. He took that on. It's kind of his new name. But yeah, first cousin of Murgy.
Interesting. Do you, the person that shared that with you, were they able to connect Charlie and him, like having any?
No documented interactions, but they very well could have. We know Chicago had some kind of relationship with Pittsburgh when LaRocca was boss. There was, I think we talked about it. There was some kind of dispute in Florida, was it, where Chicago and Pittsburgh had to meet, something to that effect. I don't even remember what it was about.
I think I know what you're talking about. There was a Chinese gambling syndicate.
Yep, that's it.
That was in Chicago, Pittsburgh. I think even
Liang.
Yeah. I think Kind Wee Moy was the head guy or something like one of the guys in Pittsburgh, maybe. But yeah, like Pecora and LaRocca helped them reopen their gambling establishment in Chicago after the Chicago mob shut it down by creating a payment schedule. And then they also got paid because of that agreement. And then that agreement even survived because Pecora died in 1987. He was the underboss in the early 80s. And then Charles Porter, who succeeded him, went down to Florida to collect the payment and, met with the guy and was like, hey, now I'm doing what Pecora used to do now, just so you know. And then he was collecting after that.
Yeah, because that came out in the testimony of the trial.
Yeah.
I remember reading because they had a pretty good, there was a lot of details, in the testimony on how that operation actually worked.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question for you guys. Sorry.
What's that?
Just you mentioned Pecora's rank. I was just curious offhand. We know Mike Genovese was LaRocca's right-hand man for decades. What was his actual rank? Was he the underboss before he became boss, or?
That is a little tough to nail down. Like, in my mind, in the late 50s and the 60s, into the first half of the 1970s, it's very clear that he's in that role. Like he has that power, even if he doesn't officially have the title. Like, there's this little bit of a back and forth between Kelly Manarino, and Genovese. Like, I think Manarino might have been the official, but Genovese was the heir apparent. And so he had a lot of power because of that. And as Jimmy had said to me in a phone call, like, the FBI was referring to Mike Genovese in the 60s as like the co-boss of the Pittsburgh family. And I would agree with that because whenever LaRocca hated winter, so he would go down to Florida for like 6 months at a time sometimes.
With Joe
And he would,
Regino.
yeah, with Joe Regino,
Yep.
the response town, and they would go down there, and Genovese would be in charge for that period of time. Obviously, they would check in via phone and whatnot, but he had a lot of power. You know, it seemed like his members thought that he had the power of life and death over them when he was there, according to source reports. And so he made it very clear that he was going to be his heir. And then what Jimmy had referred to earlier, he had a heart attack in the late 60s. And that started the vultures circling a little bit. And people were saying, he's done in the rackets and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he clearly was not. And he reasserted himself. But there seems to have been a little bit of a shaking of the faith in the 70s at some point. And, you know, there's this confusion in the sources even in newspaper reports where, like, it's unclear who the next person is going to be. You know, you have Cora, who's this kind of affable guy who is very popular, and then you have Genovese, who definitely has more experience, and in my opinion, a little more force behind him. But they're clearly like in contention for the boss's seat. But I'm not talking like violent contention, but sort of like LaRocca's. It seems like he's trying to make a decision, and according to what Jimmy was saying, like it seems like he was favoring Pecora at the end. But then Pecora was in prison, and really the only person who had the experience and really deserved it. I mean, he was running the family for a very long time.
Yeah.
Was Mike.
Right. And you know, Eric, Paul, I was going to say, you know, I think where JoJo began to curry favor with LaRocca is he reinvigorated the gambling scene across the border in West Virginia. You know, John LaRocca personally sent him to go live there because at the time, West Virginia had those, they were called federal gaming stamps. And West Virginia had so many of them. And Mike Genovese had a very, very, very close friend by the name of Chuck Teamer. And very much like what the mob did in Las Vegas, they wanted to put more of a squeaky clean, square guy in charge of the operation in name only, and then insert their people into the casinos for the take and the skim. And Chuck Teamer, he worked out in Vegas. He knew how to run a casino. And JoJo Pecora, he oversaw everything. In fact, JoJo lived in a trailer for a while behind Club 30 while he was building his home. He was a guy that was out on the floor, kind of like what they said in the movie Casino about Ace Rothstein. He ate, slept, and breathed gambling. JoJo was a numbers guy. And he turned those casinos around, and they became a cash cow for the Pittsburgh family. And now, a majority of that cash was getting whacked up amongst the top 3 or 4 guys. But Zebo worked. He got his start. You know, he worked for JoJo for many, 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 many years. And he had always explained to friend of Henry, you know, personally that he was starving under JoJo. That JoJo didn't really take care of his people. You know, he kept the lion's share, and he gave enough money for everybody else in his crew to function. Kind of reminds me of the Bronx Tale when Chaz Palminteri is sitting there explaining himself in that bar, and he said, you know, I treat my guys good, but not too good, because then they don't need me anymore. And that's what Zatola was kind of going through. And then once Mike Genovese came on the scene and his responsibility became greater, he started making a lot more money. You know, there's no evidence that Henry was involved in the narcotics trafficking, but I would find it hard to believe at that point, with all the steel mills and all the factories and everything else shut down, when narcotics became that big source of income. I can't imagine too many people saying no to that stream of revenue that was coming in when so many other rackets were drying up.
Did they have made members in West Virginia then?
There was, to my knowledge, no, there were two people over the course of about 65 years that ran West Virginia. One of them was a Greek guy by the name of William Big Bill Lias, Lias. Paul Hankish was that new kid on the block. And, you know, Paul Hankish came into power and rose to power, and he was Lebanese. Now, here's the interesting thing about Paul Hankish. He was wired all over the country. Eric, I know you like relationships. There was a gentleman in the Gambino family, the New Jersey crew. And this gentleman's name was Joseph Demas. His nickname was Demas. Last name was Covello, Covello. From what I've been able to find out, he was a captain, okay? And he was with the New Jersey, the Cherry Hill Gambinos.
Oh, really? Okay.
Paul Hankish was godfather to one of his kids, and Demas was godfather. Paul had two daughters. His one daughter still lives in Brooklyn, New York. She still lives there. But Demas was her godfather. And then Joey Naples from Youngstown was godfather to one of Paul Hankish's others. Now, in the documents that I have with Paul Hankish, his relationships extended all the way to Raymond Patriarca in Providence, Rhode Island. He laid off, he was one of the biggest bookmakers in the country. You know, in his federal trial, the name Art Rooney, owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, when they went in and they raided his place, they found Rooney's names all over the books. And they saw that he was a degenerate gambler, and Paul Hankish, that gambling network, he had whales, and he was laying off hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a week in different areas of the country, primarily New Jersey with Joseph Covello, and up in the Providence, Rhode Island area, he had 2 or 3 bookmakers out of Providence that he was laying a lot of his other money off to. Very, very interesting character. He was Lebanese. I want to say, Paul, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it Bill Lias that tried to have him killed in a car bomb, and then one of Paul Hankish's legs got blown off, and he had a prosthetic, or he walked with crutches, but he survived the car bombing attack. I want to say it was back in the 60s.
1964, yeah.
Was it 64?
And he ended up losing both legs. One of them was just partially. So in the actual bombing, only one got detached, and the other one was partially attached still. But then surgery, they had to cut the other one off.
Hence the nickname No Legs.
Yeah. So whenever you see a picture of him, you can see the braces for his crutches. Usually, if they show the top half of him. But somehow, and this is one of the amazing stories, I think, from Pittsburgh area, is like he still managed to take over the rackets after that happened in Wheeling. He tried to kill Lias actually with those Gambino guys he knew. They hung around outside his house for a long time, but he never came out. And eventually word got back to Hankish that he was aware that they were trying to kill him, and the FBI was also aware that they were trying to kill him, and so they called it off. But he ended up dying of old age in 1970, and then Hankish was free to do whatever he wanted. And he was already in charge before then, but you know, that guy was still hanging around. But he held such a grudge against Lias for obvious reasons that he had one of his associates go in and steal the prayer cards from the funeral parlor and the condolence book. So he really hated that guy until the end. But that's one of the more interesting people for sure. He was also connected to he was friends with really Samuel the plumber de Cavalcante.
Yes, in New Jersey.
And there was a story that a bunch of kind of underworld goofs were trying to ship a giant load of marijuana through Atlantic City. Somehow the Gambinos found out, and they were like, "Look, you got to give us." The load had already gone through, and they sold it, and they were like, "Look, you got to give us this much money because this is how much we think you made from that." And they were worried they were going to get killed, and so Samuel the plumber de Cavalcante gets involved, and he gets Paul Hankish involved too, and basically they convince a guy, a Gambino soldier who's in prison, whose name is escaping me, sorry, to take to pretend basically that he was in on that deal, and then he got paid, and so it kind of removed this threat from the Gambino family because one of their soldiers, allegedly had a part of it. And then once that occurred, this sort of a goofball who was trying to get that marijuana, he was a kind of a shady importer, so he had a lot of money and he liked to gamble, so he started to gamble with Paul Hankish, and he got behind on his payments. So Paul went up with one of his goons to his office, and they busted into the office, and he was sitting there talking to someone, and he realized it was serious, so he told the guy he was having a meeting with. Even this is all from court transcripts, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Sorry, so many documents I look at. But he's he walks in there with his crutches, and he has a gun in his hand, and he points at the guy, and he's like, "You owe me some money." And the goon proceeds to take the guy's head and bash it into the wall. So he was definitely feared even after this accident. And one of the funnier pieces of testimony, a contractor came in to fix the office after that incident, said that it looked like somebody had used that guy's head as a stud finder.
Speaking of the Gambino connections, Jimmy, and I think you and I have talked about him maybe recently. There was a Gambino member, Dave Iacovetti, and he was made with the Gambinos. He was close to Sam DeCavalcante too, but he like bounced between Connecticut, Altoona, Baltimore, Florida. He was like this journeyman. And we were talking about a document recently though, because he was a relative of Jack Varilla in Altoona, and I think the document said he sponsored Varilla for membership. They were related, I think, through marriage, but he ends up with the Gambino family for sure. But he's all over he's all over the place. He's connected to everybody. He's kind of an enigma, but his name shows up. I'm wondering if he might have been a transfer. If he sponsored Varilla into the Pittsburgh family, he might have been, when he was living in Altoona, he could have been with Pittsburgh. We know transfers happen sometimes. But did you ever come across much about Iacovetti?
I have not. I'll be honest with you. No, I did see that post from you guys, and it intrigued me, but I had not heard of him.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what I did after you had posted that document online, Eric. The first thing I went to was newspapers.com, and I just kind of threw a 30-year time period out there, trying to see if maybe this guy had an arrest prior from spending any time there, and I didn't find anything. So it's something, if we're interested, that might be something a little bit more to explore, because just being sponsored by him, well, what authority does he have to sponsor him into that family? And to me, I have always found Pittsburgh to be pretty fascinating because of the relationships across the country. So many Pittsburgh members transferred out of there between, San Jose, they were connected. Antonio Repepi connected to the Corby brothers down in Baltimore. But so many of these powerful guys in Pittsburgh, like Frank Valenti and Dominic Anzalone and the Adragnas that ended up going out to San Jose. And then, one of my all-time favorite mysterious characters was the guy that ran kind of the Western Pennsylvania around my area in Farrell and Mercer County, was a guy by the name of Salvatore Marino. Right around the 60s, he was kind of heading into semi-retirement. Now, when you go to John LaRocca's FBI files, Sal Marino is with him constantly. They are out in California. They're visiting with Tony Pindilli out there, who was the slot machine czar in Gary, Indiana. He was a Chicago member. You got them in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and then Sal Marino's son, as we all know, Angelo, took over the family, and he was married to Precious Maggio. Her father was, if I'm not mistaken, a captain, or if not a captain, at least a made member in the Philadelphia family. So, these intermarriages, it was just brought to my attention the other day that Tony Milano from Cleveland, his son, was married to Steve Zaccoli's daughter. Steve Zaccoli, he got his start in Pittsburgh and in Steubenville with Jimmy Tripodi, which is something I would love to touch on, Paul. We've talked about a little bit about Youngstown and Johnstown and Altoona. Steubenville, was also a very, very big faction for the Pittsburgh family. It was a mini Youngstown. It was a steel mill town where Dino Crocetti was born and raised there. Dean Martin became a craps dealer in Cosmo Quattrone's casino. And what fascinates me most about Steubenville, very much like Youngstown, is it was a very, very large Calabrian element there. Do you know much about like Italian history, Italian genealogy, Paul?
Not as much as I'd like to, I'll be honest. I learned a lot from watching this show, honestly.
I don't know as much as some people, but over the years, Angelo and Rick, they really educated me on the differences between the Calabrians and the Sicilians and the Neapolitans, and how how they run their organized crime groups so differently. And in Youngstown, you had a very, very large Calabrian element. And they kind of ran their own thing, and the Sicilians did their own thing. And the Neapolitans did their own thing for a very long time in Youngstown before these affiliations started to happen with other families. And it seems, at least in Youngstown, by reference, there was a lot of conflict between the Calabrese and the Sicilians. They didn't like one another. They were competitors. They were not on the same team. And going into Steubenville, with Vincenzo Tripodi and Cosmo Quattrone and Bruno Tagano and Ernie Gianamori, these guys were all Calabrian. Most of them come from the Archi, Reggio Calabria area. And when you look on a map and you look at that area of Calabria where they came from, to this day, there's still a lot of activity with the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia, still dominates that part of southern Italy. They are now recognized as the largest criminal organization in the United States, and they have cells everywhere. So when I look at Jimmy Tripodi, very much like Eric, I love the relationship aspect of it, the genealogy of it. I'm fascinated with it. And when you go through Jimmy Tripodi's FBI file, you know, he was in constant contact with Steve Zaccoli out in San Jose. He was in regular contact with Rocco Pellegrino, who was arguably one of the most powerful Genovese family captains in Westchester County. Their tentacles kind of went everywhere. And when you look at the Calabrians in the Pittsburgh family, you know, Kelly Manarino and his brother Sam, you know, AKA Ruggiero, you know, was their surname. Tony Repepi, you know, another Calabrian, going all the way back to John Bazzano. You know, they were connected to the Calabrians in Steubenville and Youngstown, going all the way to Tony Milano in Cleveland. And, you know, the FBI files in the 1960s with Youngstown, they chronically refer to this Calabrese organization, with Tony Milano in Cleveland kind of being the head of that organization, trickling all the way down through the Ohio River Valley into Steubenville and Pittsburgh, and how this network of Calabrians all worked with one another. You know, fascinating. And then when you look at, you know, all the surveillance, I mean, they had Jimmy Tripodi up in Cleveland at the Italian American Club owned by Tony Milano. He was there every other week, you know, with guys like Dominic Malamo and Paul Romeo. There was a whole network of Calabrians that would all meet with Tony Milano on a semi-regular basis. I have not come across any concrete evidence that that network of people were working on specific crimes with one another, but I have to assume, why is Tony Repepi in Pittsburgh up in Mayfield and Cleveland meeting with Tony Milano and Jimmy Tripodi and Dominic Malamo and Paul Romeo? They had something going on. You know, they had something going on.
Thing I want to point out too is that geographically, like you mentioned the Milano Zaccoli marriage, and the Zaccolis were from San Stefano in Aspromonte, and the Milanos were from San Roberto. That's like crossing the street. You know, those are tiny little villages that are right next to each other, pretty much. And so there's clearly something there in terms of ethnic camaraderie. They were part of the same network, and you know, that ethnic aspect is a big part of Pittsburgh, where there was a wiretap of Angelo Bruno and his brother-in-law, who was a captain, and they were talking about the Pittsburgh family, and they're like, when you hang out with John LaRocca, he constantly refers to everybody's ethnicity. He's talking about so and so's Calabrian, so and so's Neapolitan, so and so's Sicilian. So like this is part of the dynamic. We know it, the politics, like you're saying in Youngstown, it informs the mafia politics, but it's something these guys were constantly referring to. You know, LaRocca himself, like he got along with these guys. They're high-ranking members of his family, but he felt it necessary to be like, yeah, he's a Calabrian. He's this. It was on their minds to some degree.
You know, I'm actually glad you touched on that. It does. It brings up, you know, in my case, it brings up some personal and some, you know, some funny memories. You know, my family all comes from Reggio Calabria. My mom's side of the family from down in Plati, in a little village of Chirella. They got about 310 people total that still live in that little village today. And my father's side of the family, they all come from the area of Casagnana, Bianco, which is near Benestare, Bovellino, more on the Ionian seaside of Reggio Calabria. And yeah, everybody in my family were immigrants, and they all spoke very broken. And my mom's sister, she met a gentleman. My mom and her sister I had an uncle that owned a tailor-made clothing store in Youngstown. Ironically, Paul, where Mike Genovese bought all of his suits from. My uncle had this business for about 60 years. Okay. It was a successful business, and he was he was very, very close with the gentleman that we're all talking about. And they used to meet at his store. He had a back office, he had a beautiful bar, and guys from Cleveland and Pittsburgh that were looking to get some beautiful suits to look dapper, something tailor-made. That's where they went. And my mom and her sister, they used to work there, for extra money. And my uncle, he only hired Italians. And he found this guy right off the boat from Abruzzi. And he was a tailor. And anyhow, my aunt was working there as a sales associate. She met Lino, and they started courting each other. And then my grandfather found out he was from Abruzzi. And he read her the riot act. And I used to say to my mom, I'm like, I just don't get it. He's from Italy. I mean, my God, I don't get it, and, even though they're from the same country, it's like being from the Northeast or being from down in Mississippi. You might as well call it two different worlds. But my grandfather couldn't stand the people that came from Abruzzi. He used to go, he would spit. He couldn't stomach them. And, we're on a podcast, and I'm going to respect Angelo's about the language. I don't even want to go into what he said about Sicilians. Okay. But long story short, in my lifetime, sitting at that dinner table with 30 immigrants, this one, she's a Napolitan. She's a Napolitan. The women were like that, So, with Eric referencing what, John LaRocca, I think a lot of the old school, those first generation immigrants that came to this country, I think, in Italy, right? The North doesn't like the South. They look at them as peasants, uneducated. And you have a lot of industry up north. And for whatever reason, the Italian government invested all of their resources into the north where all your work and your industry and your factories are. And they don't look too kindly on the Southern Italians whatsoever. And it's still like that today. So in my case, and probably many other people who grew up in an Italian immigrant family, whether they were Napolitan or Siciliano, it doesn't matter. They were going to have something to say about those other cultures, probably based going all the way back to their childhood. You could say it's real greaseball shit, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you're young too, I mean, it tells you that the fact that you saw some of that in your family tells you it must have been that much stronger a generation or two earlier,
Yeah. I can remember, in Youngstown, Dominic Malamo, he had the Calabrese Mutual Aid Society, and they called it the Calabrese Club. My grandfather was the treasurer there, and every Tuesday and every Thursday night, Jimmy Prado picked him up because my grandfather never got a driver's license. Somebody drove him to work. He was a shoemaker, and he ran numbers out of a shoe shop. He wasn't real heavy, but he ran numbers to make ends meet, like so many other Italians did back in those days. And they would go down and they would play pinochle down at the Calabrese Club. And there were no Sicilian, no Neapolitan, there were no other members. If you weren't Calabrese, get out of the club. They didn't want you there. Even the workers there, the bartender, I remember this guy, John Salvatore, he was Calabrian. They wouldn't even hire non-Calabrians. You know, I don't have a big reference, you know, to go off of, but you know what I can tell you from, you know, from my experience, and you know, for example, like where I live now in Massachusetts, you know, long story short, there's a big Brazilian and Portuguese population here. The reason being is because they dominate the fishing trade. So they're in on the ports, they're out on fishing boats. And I have a couple of Brazilian people that work for me. And one of them is from an area in southern Brazil, and another one is from an area more in northern Brazil. And then I got a girl from Portugal. And for whatever reason, I have to schedule them on opposite shifts. They don't get along because of long-standing cultural feuds in their home country that people like me, whatever, you know, you don't get it. But there are underlying things that happen in those countries for generations. And you know, to me, I look back at it and I kind of laugh. You know, I find it funny, but some of those first generation Italians, they were fanatical. You know, they were absolutely fanatical about Tony Repepi is the perfect example. You know, I was shocked that one of his daughters married Stanley Valenti, who was not Calabrian. His other daughter married John Bazzano Jr. Okay. The rest of his daughters all married Calabrian people not affiliated with the mob. Tony was a guy who was proud to be Calabrese, absolutely proud. He wore it with pride. And any chance he got to take a shot at a Sicilian, he would take it. And it just goes back to their childhood, and it goes back to the way that they grew up, probably an element of the way that they were raised by their own parents and the things that they heard, and the things, you know, that were said. I mean, Jesus, I mean, I can remember one Easter, whole family was there, and my mom's sister, her husband from Abruzzi, he started saying something, and my grandfather started shouting some shit out in Italian at him. And I looked over at my mom. I'm like, what did Papa say? And she said, he just told Uncle Lino to shut the fuck up. I'm like, all right. He didn't want to hear it. And they were talking about something with the government in Italy. I was maybe 13, 14 years old, and it was this big thing with the Italian government. And you know, it's crazy. You know, it's crazy, but it's reality. You know,
Yeah, a lot of this
absolutely reality.
parochialism, you know, it goes back to, like you said, you know, could be taking sides, World War II with Mussolini and fascism, or going back to,
Sure.
you know, the independence, going back to Garibaldi. I mean, or the Bourbon Kingdom. I mean, because these memories go back, they could go back hundreds of years.
Right.
Going into, as far as early Pittsburgh goes, in terms of the mafia, you had people that were coming from San Francisco. You had people coming up from New Orleans, like the Monasteros. A lot of them were involved in the banana produce, and many of the members came from Travia. And Pittsburgh at that time, between 1890s and 1910, you had several different colonies of Sicilians. You had the Hill, which had a little bit, and then you had East Liberty. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think East
Yep.
Liberty.
Larimer, East Liberty. Yeah.
And you can find a lot of its members in the papers early on in the 1900s, because a lot of them had legitimate records. They were noted as being parts of legitimate Italian societies. Their names were in the papers. But then you also had this other element, which is those involved in counterfeiting, the Society of the Banana, different things like that. And it seems like it was a family early on that wasn't overly violent, I wouldn't say. It seems like I mean, they had their people that could do things, but it seems to have been a pretty calm family up until the 1920s, and then things really took an explosion from 1920 to 1930, and then after that things kind of calmed down again.
Yeah, I would agree with that generally. Sure. Um, and like, not that that was uncommon, right? I mean, like, I think probably, I mean, I don't know about every mafia early history wise, but prohibition was just like, you know, tons of murders and all that. And I don't think Pittsburgh was any different. I think I read something where it said there were 200 murders during that period of time.
In Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen that. I'm not saying I don't know if there was or not. I mean, there might have been. Um, there was a lot going on in Pittsburgh in the 1920s was very corrupt. You had, politicians that were involved in certain things. And honestly, a lot of the politicians kind of really had a hand in organized crime. Even Joe Regina in the 60s, when he'd go down to Florida, I believe there was some state senator or somebody in politics that would go down to Florida with him. And he was also partnered with the police commissioner in cigarette vending machines in Johnstown.
Yeah. In the 60s. Yep. I definitely read that. Um, and like, for going back farther, once again, I didn't focus on this, but I definitely saw a few things on it. They were actually competing with gangs of police and politicians, basically, like back in the day, like before they became more integrated and they were actually able to corrupt the system, I think, more thoroughly. There was this separation, and the cops were running booze as well, and that was their competition. So I don't think that they had sort of a lock on their city at that time, like maybe the mob had in other cities. There was that competition that you really can't. I mean, what are you going to do with state actors? You can't really, you can't challenge them. It's not going to happen. Not very well anyway.
Going back to because we know, mafia families around the United States formed around colonies of Campesani, which are guys from the same hometowns and regions. And in addition to what Angelo said about Trebia, Monastero was from Kokomo. He came from Monastero's father was one of the guys lynched in New Orleans, so they were a mafia clan. The Limas were from Trebia. But in addition to that, you had an element from historic Caltanissetta, what's now Enna, and that overlapped with Buffalo and Pittston. And LaRocca, like one of you mentioned, LaRocca lived in Jamestown, which was Buffalo territory, but he shared his origins in Sicily with many Buffalo members, some of the founders of the Buffalo family. So in Pittsburgh, you have some crossover there in terms of Sicilian origins too. It's Eastern Palermo, Caltanissetta, and what's now Enna. The boundaries changed on that, but that's an interesting thing about it too in the development, that it paralleled some of the other families in the region as well.
Yeah, and I mean, from everything from everything that I've been able to pick up between Pittsburgh and Buffalo, they seem to have a pretty good working relationship with one another, as did Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Fast forwarding, Paul, kind of into that time frame that you were writing about, so many things happened for that Pittsburgh Cleveland war to go on. First and foremost, Jack Licavoli, who succeeded John Scalish as the boss of Cleveland, he was the first mafia boss tried under the RICO statute. Okay, and he was convicted, and I believe that was in 1982. When he got indicted, the family was in disarray. Angelo Leonardo had kind of taken over some of the duties as an acting boss, and he made a few people. Having said that, Pittsburgh saw that it was ripe for the taking. They knew that Angelo Leonardo at the time was in his 70s, and he was getting up there in age. He had been in the rackets for more than 50 years at that point. And, that first murder in the war happened in September of 1978. There was a total of 12 bodies that dropped, and they were fighting for total control over the rackets in Youngstown. And, at the end of the day, what they found was that for decades prior, Cleveland was the much stronger family. Going back to the early days of the 1920s and 30s, Cleveland was a national power, as far as a syndicate. The Leonardos and the Pirellos, they had relationships all the way to Chicago and New York. They were a much stronger family than Pittsburgh. When John Scalish died, if John Scalish was still alive, that war never would have happened, because John LaRocca and John Scalish, they worked very well together for 3 decades. They had a mutual respect for one another. Their wives spent time with one another. And the same with Angelo Leonardo and Kelly Manarino. They had a great working relationship, so to speak. I mean, LaRocca, Scalish, Manarino, and Leonardo, for all intents and purposes, they worked together for more than 3 decades. I don't think Jack Licavoli had the respect that John Scalish had. And even though Licavoli was, Sicilian, like LaRocca, I think when he took over, I don't really think he was boss material. I don't think that Licavoli, first and foremost, he wasn't a leader cut out from the cloth that John Scalish was. Jack Licavoli, he was a thug. That he was a street guy. John Scalish, John LaRocca, they were a little more polished. They would overlook violence for prosperity. They would shy away from violence as long as it kept the business running and the money coming in, and they didn't want to draw. Not saying that they didn't commit violence, but they minimized it. When Jack Licavoli took over, I think when they saw what was going on with Cleveland and the Carabia brothers in Youngstown, they saw an opportunity to expand their criminal empire, and they took that opportunity and they fought it out in the streets, and Pittsburgh came out on top. And it wasn't long after the last killing was in 1982. It was 6 months after Jack Licavoli got indicted. Angelo Leonardo was indicted in 1983, and then he ended up turning state's evidence. So I think that war certainly served as a catalyst for the downfall of the Cleveland family. Not saying that what Cleveland was doing, Angelo Leonardo, he got nailed on narcotics trafficking. To the day he died, he swore he knew nothing about it. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what to believe. What I do know is that if you looked at Angelo and Leonardo and in the previous 50 years, he stayed away from any of the narcotics. He had a capo by the name of Joe Gallo who was heavily involved, and he had a group of associates that kind of followed suit. Now, whether he knew where that money was coming from or not is up for debate. There's never been anything concrete. All you can do is kind of go off of his word. Angelo Leonardo had a lot to lose. He was married to one of John Scalish's sisters. His brother-in-law was Mace Rockman, who many people described as the Meyer Lansky of Cleveland. Mace Rockman was a childhood friend of John Scalish. John Scalish married Mace Rockman's sister. Mace Rockman married one of John Scalish's sisters. They grew up in the same neighborhood. They went to school together. And when Angelo Leonardo flipped, it was tough because his wife was the sister of Mace Rockman. He and his wife became estranged. They never got divorced, but they became estranged because he cooperated with the FBI. He decimated the Cleveland family. They never recovered after his testimony. Angelo Leonardo as well. He testified in the 1980 commission case against the 5 bosses in New York. He also testified in Kansas City and Chicago. And, I think where he did the most damage was the Teamsters Union. He gave up the entire Vegas skim, the stranglehold that Bill and Jackie Presser and Mace Rockman had on the Teamsters Union. And I think you saw right around that time that Angelo Leonardo gave that testimony, that's when you started to see so many of these Teamster locals being looked at a lot closer and putting under federal supervision. He kind of got that domino effect started, through his testimony. People
he really hurt
looking...
Chicago and Kansas City too. But I think a big factor with Cleveland is that John Scalish reportedly didn't make any guys during his rule. And so many guys had died out during the interim period that by the time Jack Licavoli became boss, it was pretty dry. They really didn't have a lot to work with. And so once they were put away in prison, it was easy pickings for Pittsburgh to move in.
Sure.
It was disaster after disaster. He didn't make guys. Then the Danny Green War happened. Then you have, like Jimmy was saying, the new boss, like Voley, and then you have Pittsburgh being like, all right, all these guys were killed in the Danny Green War, and the leader of Youngstown went to jail because of the hit on Danny Green, Ronnie Crabia. Even he maybe could have, Pittsburgh might have not thought as much about it if he wasn't out of the picture. And then you have Leonardo flipping and the Youngstown War, so two wars within like basically 5 years, and no family could survive that, especially a small Midwestern one. They limped along, I think, up until the 2000s, but much like Pittsburgh, I'm pretty sure they're gone. Maybe one member left or something like that. But not a family structure or anything like that. But yeah, that's one of the more fascinating things because it is out of character for Pittsburgh to go into full-blown war like that, but they definitely saw that opportunity. And there was millions to be made in Youngstown. Youngstown was super important to the Pittsburgh family. Like, I mean, as far as definitely like enforcers and all that, like a lot of the best stories are from Youngstown. I mean, it really is like for many different reasons, like one of the places you have to focus on when you talk about the Pittsburgh family, and the Cleveland family, really.
Did Leonardo say much about Pittsburgh?
He did, actually. I don't think we'd have as good of an understanding of the Second Youngstown War if it wasn't for Angelo Leonardo. I mean, it was devastating for Cleveland, but I'm glad he flipped because as a historian, it's great. He talks about his meetings with Manorino and LaRocca, which is super rare. I mean, there's not a lot of documentation about that kind of stuff. And luckily for both those guys, they're basically dead or close to dead when he flipped. So it was okay. And Mike Genovese, he definitely was involved in Youngstown stuff before then, but he wasn't the lead on it. So it didn't really hurt him. So they got lucky on that. And historians and Mike Genovese got lucky. But it's really some of the best stuff to understand that. And there's so much focus on it right now. There's a whole Facebook group dedicated to just Youngstown Mafia stuff, and a lot of people are on it, talking about things every day. Youngstown Mob. It's been enlightening, honestly. A lot of it's just talking about relatives and stuff like that, but there's a few tidbits in there that you can pull out, just family stories and whatnot. That I'm sure Jimmy's familiar with some of that too. But Pittsburgh, it one of the things I wanted to mention is, like, throughout its history, it had a very good secret hierarchy, like what it was supposed to be. I think they were able to keep themselves in the shadows for very long periods of time, even though people generally knew who they were. No boss ever went to prison for a very lengthy period of time. I could say that from Monastero to Genovese. Before that, I'm not as sure, but some were assassinated back in the early days, but really no jail time. Mike Genovese was so secretive. Jimmy mentioned this a little bit, but his street tax actually generated a little bit of a conflict with the Philly family. And stop me if you heard this story before, but his brother-in-law, Joseph Mistico, lived in the Pittsburgh area, and he was getting pressured by the Pittsburgh family to give part of his bookmaking business, a percentage up to kick up as part of that overall tax. And he complained to Scarfo. Scarfo was already, it was 1986, so he was already kind of infamous. The Riccobini War had already happened, and a bunch of other internal family murders. So Mike Genovese, being somebody who reads the papers and watches the news, did not want to meet with him because he knew that he would be followed to Pittsburgh. And so he sent Chucky Porter, the person who at that point was gonna be the underboss, was already very influential. Joe Sika, an older member, and then Louis Volpe, who the Volpe brothers, the last surviving member of the Volpe brothers, from Wilmerding. And those guys met with Nicky Scarfo at a Monroeville Marriott Hotel in a little restaurant called the Gamut's Lounge. There's actually a very blurry picture that me and Jimmy have of them meeting. I guess an FBI agent got in there and tried to take a photo, but with like 10 of those cagey guys hanging around, it's not a very good photo. Scarfo's head is blocked. You can see Porter, and maybe Phil Leonetti, if you guys know of him, the underboss. But Leonetti ended up testifying about this meeting. That's how we know so much about it. But Genovese, a Don came to visit in his territory, and he did not come out to meet him because he did not want to be in a photo with Nicky Scarfo. And basically after I was told by a former law enforcement source, that they followed Porter the morning after, like 7 a.m. He was driving around, and then eventually he gets to a hardware store that was off of Route 22, and he gets out of his car in the parking lot, and Mike Genovese is there. And they talk for a while, and they don't know what they were talking about, but I assume it's the meeting. And that's how he operated. Like, I tried to get I would have loved to have gotten this, but I tried to get in touch with Phil Leonetti. It's kind of difficult. I wasn't able to, but I wanted to ask him, what did Scarfo think of that? Basically, like, he visited this territory and then the boss didn't come out to meet him. Like, I can't imagine he was too happy about it, but it's just me imagining as far as that goes. I did want to know that detail.
So Chucky Porter, I don't know much about that era at all. I mean, a lot of what I've learned about Pittsburgh has come through Jimmy,
Mhm.
but that era where Chucky Porter, I don't know anything about his story really. Obviously, he's a big name. I've read a couple things. Was he actually only half Italian on his mother's side, or was Porter an anglicized name?
He was three-quarters Italian, and his father was basically part Irish.
Yeah.
And so he had that over half at least. But I know that like the family, the elders of the family, and this is from actually a recent conversation I had with FOH. It seemed like they were a little bit nervous about him. I don't think Mike Genovese was. I don't think John LaRocca was, honestly. He was
He
photographed.
and John were very tight.
Yeah, like he was photographed meeting with him at that Allegheny car wash, which was his headquarters a lot of in the late 70s. And he became close to Mike Genovese too, and uh, made a lot of money for them. He was kind of started out as a leg breaker, like a lot of guys do. Um, and then he was with the Manorinos as a bodyguard, I think, and a driver. Um, and then he had sort of a different stints. He was a drug dealer and whatnot, and he would uh, work with drug dealers, basically. Like I think I said it earlier, kind of like a boss of drug dealers in a way. Nick DeBlage's Wale, um, Droznek, Joey Rosa, who eventually became an informant. Um, those guys kind of reported up to him even earlier than what before he was the underboss. And then you have Lou Rauchi, who was uh, also a partner in the drug business and also very high up in the family in the 80s too. Both Rauchi and Porter met with Genovese on a daily basis. I don't know what Rauchi's official title would be. In the book, I called him, because this is what the crime commission calls him. Sometimes the FBI, I think, too, a lieutenant. I don't know that he had an official title, but he. If you're talking to Mike Genovese every day, you're powerful. So,
Yeah, and I think one of the other things too, Paul, that I wanted to bring up with Chucky Porter, um, he was affiliated with a gentleman by the name of Paul Mazzai. Have you come across his name?
yep.
Paul Mazzai was actually kind of an important character, in terms of Pittsburgh. The movie Goodfellas, when Henry Hill is talking about his Pittsburgh connection, he's referring to Paul Mazzai. Paul Mazzai was that cocaine connection, and he was the guy that set Chucky Porter up with Ramon Sosa, who was that Cuban national down in Miami. Paul Mazzai was also instrumental in the Boston College point shaving scandal of the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Henry Hill, who was an associate that Ray Liotta played in the movie of the Lucchese crime family, he was also very instrumental in the Boston College point shaving scandal. They basically got their hooks into a couple of kids at Boston College, and they were throwing games. And those guys were making a lot of money, on the gambling front, putting money on those games. But Paul Mazzai was technically the guy that got Chucky Porter into the narcotics. He was the guy that connected the dots. And if I'm not mistaken, I think his father was a bookmaker, back in the 40s and 50s. And, Paul was supposed to have a future with the Pittsburgh LCN. And then when he got into the narcotics, back in the 60s and 70s, Amato and LaRocca didn't quite care for that. They wanted to stay away from that. But he and Chucky Porter were very, very tight. And, he acted as basically a liaison between Eugene Giswali, Chucky Porter, and the guys down in Miami, where they were buying their kilos from.
So he was played by Beansy from The Sopranos in Goodfellas, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, Beansy.
That's the only reason I remember,
You gotta love Beansy.
Yeah, it's Beansy.
Right. But I've been in contact with Paul Mazzai's sister. We've had some previous conversations over the years, and she kind of she painted a picture of Chucky from her eyes, and I tried to get in touch with Chucky's wife, and in so many words she told me to pound sand. I get it. I don't hold any grudges. I had a few calls into his son, Charles Porter Jr., who acted as his attorney, and he did not want to talk about it. In previous dialogue that I had, as well as you have had with Roger Greenbank, the FBI agent in charge of the Pittsburgh office, he, the one time he spoke a little bit about Chucky Porter, and he said there were guys that he came into contact over the years with who had absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever. He talked about Chucky Porter and what they knew about him. And the one thing that the FBI knew about him is that he was a true family man, that he would do anything for his kids, that with his second wife, Joyce, he was a gentleman. He was, for all intents and purposes, somebody that they can get their hooks into. He got a 28-year sentence, diabetes. He wasn't getting the medical care that in prison, and that's why they kept going to see him. And finally he started to talk, and 8 years later he was reunited with his family. And just through people I know in the Pittsburgh area, all he did was spend his remaining years with his children and his grandchildren. Mike Genovese Jr. ran into him a few times at an Italian restaurant, and the one time he was with his father. Chucky saw them from across the bar, and there was no dialogue or anything like that. But 40, 50 years ago, that never would have happened. You never would have came back into the area that you got arrested in. And I think it's a clear demonstration that the mob today isn't really going after cooperating witnesses anymore. There's too much of a risk. Not saying it doesn't happen, not saying it's never going to happen, but it's slim to none. These guys are really trying to operate under the radar, for what's left of it.
And
Well,
actually,
according to an article I have in front of me, Chucky Porter only joined the mob in 1986. I mean, he became maid. And if that's accurate, he moved up really quick to underboss. And I mean, he was sent to prison in 1990. So
he was made and then made underboss soon after that.
yeah.
A guy who's not even full Italian moves up that quickly. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, he's an amazing character. I think he's one of the most interesting characters from that time period. And like Jimmy was saying, it shows you how kind of weak the family was after those prosecutions, like that they weren't going to take him out. I mean, and he helped that along because he wasn't a government witness like Gravano or somebody like that who was testifying in court. He was an informant in prison. And it's clear to me that his family was still keeping in touch with him and telling him things, and some of his fellow inmates from other families were also doing the same, letting him in on business. And like Jimmy said, he was known as a friendly guy. He had a lot of respect. because of the things he did in the past, and was seen as a stand-up guy. And for like from 1992, 3 to 2000,
Yeah.
so like 7, 8 years, he was informing from prison, and his big nemesis in the 1990 trial was the one of his underlings, to Joey Rosa, who was not made, but had a long mafia lineage. His father was a made member, Frank Rosa, and his grandfather was Joseph Sica, who was also a made member and was consigliere for a little bit.
And don't forget about his paternal grandfather. He was one of the most powerful Pittsburgh gangsters in the 50s and 60s. His name was Giuseppe Rosa. And he was very, very tight with John and Frank Amato. He was one of the top guys in the outfit. And then he was, going through deportation hearings, going back to Italy. And John LaRocca was able to pull some strings with the governor of Pennsylvania in order to not get him deported. So he had the lineage. Yes, his father was a capo, but his mom's father was Joe Sica and his dad's father was Giuseppe Rosa. If I'm not mistaken, in that trial, Joey Rosa claimed to be a made member by right.
Yeah, he
by
did.
right of passage, right? He stated that. I think when he got on the witness stand, and
sounds like a common law marriage.
Right. But what I found fascinating about that, just kind of what you were saying, Paul, was that pipeline of information that Chucky Porter was feeding the FBI from prison. Part of that information was they had actually learned the travel schedule of when Joey was coming into Pittsburgh, because he had twins that were like a year old when he went away. And one of his sisters took one of them, and the other sister took the other one. And those two boys assumed the names of Joey Rosa's sisters, who were both married. So they both had different last names. I do have some photos of him and his children together, through the years. But I do know I was able to track him. And he was out in California working the jewelry business, ironically, out there. So he was living out in California for quite some time. And then when things started to quiet down, and after that trial, and then he started kind of coming back into town, visiting with his sons, visiting with his mother. It was explained to me that his grandfather, Joe Sica, Mike Genovese and him had a conversation. Joe Sica was distraught when he found out his grandson was going to testify. And, Mike Genovese kind of told him, Joe, this isn't you. You can't beat yourself up over it. And he died, shortly, when was it? 91?
I think so. Died? Yeah, I think
so. It wasn't long after that trial, but from my understanding, it put a lot of stress on him. That was his grandson that I'm sure, at the time he had high hopes for, and possibly could be one of those younger members to take that family into the future.
It's crazy. What's crazy? Bring up Joe Sica. Al DiArco, the Lucchese acting boss,
cousin.
He cooperated, and he's like, Joe Sica was my cousin, and like, DiArco didn't get made until I think 1983, and he said before that, Sica was trying to get him to move to Pittsburgh, and he wanted to Sica wanted to make not just Al, but also his son Joe, who joined the Lucchese. So like, he was trying to pull recruits through relatives, which is the old way to do it. But he was trying to pull them away from New York to become Pittsburgh members, which would have changed. I mean, just something little like that would have changed the whole history of Pittsburgh and the Lucchese family. Given he flipped too.
And ironically, if my memory serves me correct, Eric, I think Al DiArco had also stated that the reason he didn't take his cousin up on that offer is because he would have had a difficult time taking orders from his cousin.
Oh yeah, okay.
that was definitely one of them. And like, because he said he would have been completely set up, like he would have had a house and rackets already, like just ready for him to come in and just take him over, basically. And I agree with you, it would have changed their history. LaRocca was a force of nature in some ways, and I think putting him out there, he would have become prominent pretty quickly.
Mhm. And that's kind of how
Yeah,
it was back in the good days, you know. The guys would move to other towns because their relatives and friends were already members. Then they would immediately assume some level of influence through that. So shows they were trying to use the network still, but by then the network wasn't what it was.
Hmm.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of those smaller families, I mean, Pittsburgh and Cleveland are two very, very good examples of attrition and how they were not replenishing the ranks, and when they did replenish a few, it was few and far between. Um, I don't know the entire history of Milwaukee, but we could probably put Milwaukee in there as well. When they got decimated, they never recovered.
Well, we see Pittsburgh also lost some big names over the years. Like I think we touched on it briefly earlier, but Zaccoli, he moves to San Jose and he becomes the consigliere of the family. He becomes one of the administration members. Charles Carbone, who I don't think we brought up, another powerful Calabrian, he moves to San Jose and he becomes the underboss. And they take on these roles in like a matter of years. So it's like these Calabrese from Pittsburgh, and that I mean I think they were from outlying areas, right? But
Yeah,
still,
Carbone was from Johnsonburg, Pennsylvania. And if I'm not mistaken, that is in Elk County. So it's a little more toward the Allegheny Mountains. But I think, Eric, I sent you a couple of the trials that he was acquitted in murder, in the late 1920s. And I think I sent you, that was the only photo I had of him and his daughter and his wife. But you're right, you know, uh, Dominic Anzalone and Adragna and Sal Marino. I mean, these were transplanted people that went into another family, and they assumed some uh um key titles and key positions of power in those other families.
think of Tony Lima too. He was made by Monastero in Pittsburgh when he was young. He moves to San Francisco and becomes the boss there. So like all of these high-ranking members on the West Coast were originally made in Pittsburgh. And like I don't know, I assume Carbone and Zoccoli might have had some kind of maybe captains or something. They seem like they had some kind of stature before they left. But still, that's a lot of high-ranking guys leaving Pittsburgh and going to other places.
Right. And I did read that Dominic Anzalone, I know he had a casino operation going. And after about 2 or 3 months while he was out in California, um, he wasn't getting paid. And part of the deal when he went out there is that he was going to have that stream of income. From everything I've been able to read on Dominic Anzalone, he was a pretty well-to-do, very wealthy, person. And didn't he come to this country? Didn't Dominic Anzalone come to this country from Italy, and he was hunting down somebody to kill?
He was sent to the U.S. by the Sicilian according to Tony Lima, he was sent to the U.S. by the
Yes.
Sicilian mafia to kill Lima's cousin. But Lima's father was friends with all of them, and he squashed it. But Anzalone became friends with the guy he was going to kill, became a Pittsburgh member. But then he went back to Sicily. He was supposed to kill his wife because she had a lover. He
Right.
ends up he meets with his wife. They decide to separate. He comes back to Pittsburgh, gets shelved for not killing his wife, and then eventually like gets
Right.
back in good standing. But like an honor killing, he was expected to do an honor killing because that's what they did then. But yeah, that guy's just nobody knows about him, but here he has this really interesting story in Pittsburgh and San Jose.
Yeah, Steve Zaccoli is definitely somebody I've been wanting to explore a little bit further. He's one guy I don't even have a photo of. but I would love to get some of his lineage and, get an understanding of where he came from in Calabria, because the
There's definitely
relationships that he had, I mean, Jesus, I mean, he was tied to some of the top Calabrians in the continental United States within the U.S. Mafia. He was in contact with, heavyweights from the East Coast and all over the country. He was definitely part of a larger network.
he was recorded telling the San Francisco boss James Lanza, they were really close, Zaccoli and Lanza. He was recorded telling him that he had the power to go to the commission and get his boss Cerrito taken down. So I mean, he's
Wow.
first among equals on the West Coast for sure, and people have never heard of him. But those are the
Sure.
guys. Those are the guys that are the most interesting. Is they had immense power, but they're not household names. It's just
Right.
the people who needed to know, knew who he was, kind of.
Right.
Well, hey, we're at 2 hours and 20 minutes. I told you these could go for 5 hours if we wanted them to. Is there any other topics you guys want to touch on before we close out?
No,
No, I'm good.
appreciate you having us on, Angelo.
No, of course we hope to do more stuff with you.
With
Well-
the Calabrian stuff, I mean, I know Angelo's working on stuff, and with that, like, there's obviously a whole world there. I was just trying to go into the basic overview stuff that's already kind of out there.
I'm sorry. If I came off as whatever, there's other things going on, and I'm really,
there's a whole,
I'm sorry.
intricate, yeah, man, there's a whole intricate world in there that Angelo has a lot of very special insight into that goes way beyond just the fact that the Calabrians joined the mafia and that stuff. And so I mean, I imagine I would love to have future conversations with both you guys about these. Conversations are tangential, they go all over the place.
Yeah.
Paul, like, I wasn't familiar with you, Paul, but like,
Mhm.
I'm really impressed with what you've done, what you've said. I can tell you're very conservative minded, like, as far as like you there are a couple questions where, like you said, if you couldn't confirm it, you wouldn't say it. And that's like music to our ears, like you have all this insight, but you're also willing to say, like, when something isn't your territory. And then the depth of your knowledge is just very impressive. So I'm thrilled to meet you, man.
Well, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to meet you guys too. Obviously, I already knew Jimmy, but the rest of you guys I haven't met. And just watching your show before and being involved in this conversation, I learned a lot in this conversation, to be honest with you. And like, if I can make a request, you might already be looking at this, and me and Jimmy have talked about it a little bit, but the black hole that I always wanted to find more about is the 1930s boss Vincenzo Capizzi. I want to know more about that guy. So
One
if
thing
you
I
guys
do
if you
know,
guys get anything, do a show.
Jimmy mentioned Tony Pinelli, who was an Indiana-based captain in Chicago. He was from Calashabetta, and he was a business partner of Capizzi. I think Tony. This comes from Tony, who couldn't be here, but Tony found that Pinelli's mother was from Villa Rosa, same place as LaRocca and Capizzi. So there, Capizzi's a total mystery. We just know that he was the boss, but
So you know what I would love to do before we wrap this up? You just hit a chord with me. There was a gentleman, Paul. You're probably very familiar with him. He was a constant companion of John LaRocca. He was a made member, and his name was Anthony Capizzi, and he went by the nickname Wango. I'm wondering, and I need to get my friend Maggie. She lives in New Kensington, and she is an encyclopedia when it comes to dates, names, things of that nature. I'm wondering if Anthony Capizzi, John LaRocca's companion, was a direct relative of one of the earlier Pittsburgh bosses, Capizzi, the guy that was killed.
it is his son. Because
That-
Angelo, it's his son. because Angelo,
Anthony Wango Capizzi was the son of, what was his name? Vincenzo Capizzi?
yeah, because
Yeah.
Angelo was working on a chart for Pittsburgh. Like a lot of these names, I don't know. Like I'd never heard of Anthony Capizzi, but Angelo was working on a Pittsburgh chart, and I just threw in a couple like I researched a couple guys just to help him out, and I found that yeah, Capizzi was his son.
Wow. I did not know that. That's interesting.
I'd
it's
always
kind of-
thought just because of the same last name that was possible, and because there's so many father-son relationships in the mob generally, and in Pittsburgh too.
Right.
But yeah, that's pretty cool that you. But I'll save it for a future one. But that's definitely of interest to me.
Paul, what's the exact date of the book coming out?
Oh yeah, I'll do that real quick. The book is Steel City Mafia, and it's coming out on April 17th of 2023.
Cool,
Awesome.
check it out.
Thanks, guys.
Can't wait to take a look at it, man.
All right. This has been our episode of the Mob Archaeologists. We'd really like to thank Paul Hodos. We really encourage you to check out his book. We will include a link in the description. And we'd also like to thank Jimmy here, who, again, provides a tremendous amount of knowledge to this. I'm here with Rick and Eric, and you guys have a great evening.
All right. Thanks, guys.